Good afternoon, everyone. I am Loren DeJonge Schulman. I oversee the research team at the Partnership for Public Service. I have the coolest job in the world trying to find new ideas and generating thought leadership to build a better government and a stronger democracy. And today, I'm really excited to tell you more about an incredible report that we launched today on trust in government, a close look at public perceptions of the federal government and its employees. And we are so lucky to have two of the lead researchers from this effort, Nadzeya Shutava, who's joining us to talk about some of the public opinion polling and research efforts we did, as well as Paul Hitlin, who will be here to tell us more about some of the research we did around why trust matters, what we can do to improve trust in government, and what you should know about how the federal government connects with the American people. Welcome to both of you. Thank you so much. Before we get started, I want to tell everyone a little bit about why we did this effort. It starts out with a fundamental mismatch between necessity and trust, that Americans rely on their government to do a ton of things that only government can do: predict hurricanes, deliver the mail, manage healthcare crises, build our military. But for a long time, Americans haven't trusted their government, or at least that's what we've heard from public opinion polling. Some of the distrust totally makes sense. Some of it is driven by patriotic skepticism. Some of it's driven by government mismanagement. Some of it is just driven by lack of knowledge. But we are starting to see over the last couple of years, this lack of trust is having significant real-world impacts. We see this in the response to COVID. We see this in the lack of faith in our electoral processes. We saw this on January 6th. We see it in so many other cases where that absence of trust is having real-world impacts on everyone across the American public. So today, I want to talk a little bit about some of the findings about where those drivers of distrust come from. What can we learn from that, and what can we do about it? So first, I want to start with a question to you, Nadzeya, about why trust in government is so important. Why did we spend the last year studying this effort?
So some of it you already covered in your introduction, and I'm going to reiterate that trust is crucial for democratic systems to function in a healthy way. For a democracy to be strong and sustainable, it needs the public to engage and voice its preferences, and that is only possible when people from different groups of population trust the government to listen, and more importantly, to act in the best interests of the public. In our report, we talk about the so-called mistrust loop. So a lack of trust in government leads to a disengaged public, which then leads to inefficient institutions, and inefficient institutions in their turn lead to further deterioration of trust. When that loop is activated, progress slows down. Low trust can also be a barrier for the government to solve short and long-term societal issues. You mentioned public health, also emergency guidelines. People are less likely to follow those if they don't trust their government. A related but slightly different perspective is that people who don't trust their government are less likely to start working for the government. So this is a missed opportunity, and the government, it's more difficult for the government to recruit and retain qualified talent if people don't trust the government. There's certainly more in our report, but I think I covered most of the important points.
Paul, we've been studying this for almost a year now, and it's been on our minds for much longer than that. Nadzeya just laid out why this trust in government question is important. What is the main finding or takeaway that you have in this report after this year of research?
Well, thanks, Lauren. I would say there's two major things. The first is that the federal government has issues with trust. Overall, we found that 40% of the public says they trust the government at least somewhat, while 56% said they don't trust the government much at all. And about half the public said that the government actually has a negative impact on the country. So those are very real problems for the federal government, and a lot of work needs to be done to improve that. At the same time, we found that when you actually ask people about certain components of the federal government, you move outside of the sort of federal government as a totality, but you'd ask about things like federal agencies, civil servants, you actually find a fair amount of positivity there. For example, we asked for approval rates on 13 different well-known agencies, and 12 of them had more approval than disapproval. The IRS was the only one that had more disapproval, but the National Park Service, for example, 84% of people approve the National Park Service. And when we asked about, impressions of civil servants, by about 2 to 1, people agreed with positive statements about civil servants, that they're hardworking, they care about people like me. So, we found, so again, we found that the federal government, and when you go break apart those components, you see a bit of positivity and places that that the public supports when they move their focus away from the government as a whole.
So Paul, building on this question a little bit, we have known for a long time that trust in government is low. And in some ways, as I said at the opening, we've just kind of accepted this as a country. This is a given in how we function as a democracy and how our federal institutions work. But so I'm curious if you can talk more about why you thought it was important to conduct more research on these questions.
So we're certainly far from the first people to investigate trust in government. There have been a lot of organizations that have shown that trust in government has been declining for decades. We thought there was a real opportunity for us to dig a bit deeper into not only the level of trust, but understanding why people do or do not trust the government. Where do they get their information? As I said, things about what do they feel about different components of the government, and giving more depth to these questions, and also looking at ways that the government could communicate better with the public. So, we thought there was room for us to build on what's been done and ask different types of questions to give us more insight into the relationship between the government and the public.
Nadzeya, there's been a lot of people that have studied distrust in government over a long period of time. Can you tell us more about how this research was conducted, what made it unique, and what data are some of our key findings based on?
So the numbers we cite in our report are based on a new national public opinion survey that we conducted in partnership with Impact Research in October 2021. The poll was conducted online. 2,301 adults responded to the survey, and it is a nationally representative sample. That's how we were able to look into the differences between the different demographic groups. So race, different age groups, whether people live in rural or urban areas, and so on. Now, what is unique about our research is that we also work with qualitative data. We conducted focus groups, live focus groups, and also online message boards. During those, we had discussions with people about their perceptions of the government, different federal agencies, and public servants. We asked people whether they trusted the government, but most importantly, we looked into why they felt that way and what influenced those things. We also tested some of our ideas on how the situation with trust can be improved. We showed our participants videos where a few public servants talk about their day-to-day work, and they asked whether hearing people being passionate and dedicated to the work in the government had any effect on our respondents' perceptions. We have received an overwhelmingly positive response to that, so that was great to see.
So Paul, what do we mean by government, and how does it impact the interpretation of the findings that we have?
So that's a great question, and a question we're asked a lot. So obviously the partnership is very focused on the federal government as opposed to the state or local government. And we were very clear, or tried to be as clear as possible in our survey and our focus groups, to ask about not only the federal government, but to ask about things like civil servants or federal employees or agencies, to be as specific as we could in the language, so that when we were asking people a question, they weren't thinking of the government as a whole or whatever their conception is. What we did learn from our focus groups and the survey too, when you ask people just about government, they often think of politics. That's the first thing that comes to mind. They often think of gridlock and Washington, D.C. and things like that. But we wanted to not only find that out, but ask about, okay, let's shift the focus a little bit. Let's move the camera over here to some other components. And so we worked hard to try and clarify when we were asking about different parts of the government, so that we were all talking about the same thing.
I think that is just an incredible finding, that when you're asking people about government, they are not automatically thinking about the things that we think we're working on, the federal agencies, the civil servants, and so on. It is far more about politics, elections, and appointed officials. So that actually brings me to a question I'd love to hear from both of you on, and that was, what was some of the most surprising things that came to you out of this report, whether it be in the public opinion work that we did, the focus groups, or anything else? What really surprised you about why people trust or mistrust government, and also surprised you about the so what? So I'll start with Paul and then go to you, Nadzeya.
So a number of things surprised me. One of them I mentioned earlier about the positivity with agencies. The level of positivity in some cases was a surprise to me. As I think I said before, the National Park Service, 84% of people said they support the National Park Service. I'm not sure 84% of people agree on anything. And yet, that many people said they like the National Park Service. The Social Security Administration, 69% of people support the Social Security Administration. So, and even the one that was more negative was the IRS, and even the IRS had 42% of people saying they approve of it, which is higher than I probably would have guessed. So that was a surprise to me, is how much support and approval there was of agencies. And I think another thing, we looked a little bit into sort of racial differences, and I think there's a lot more work to be done there, but we found some numbers that I thought were pretty interesting. We found that people who identify as Black or African American and people who identify as Asian American have a slightly higher approval rating or rate than people who identify as white or Hispanic. About 50% of Blacks and Asian Americans said they approve of the government, compared with about 39% of the other groups. So there's a lot more research to be done on why that is, but I think that was particularly interesting to me.
Nadzeya, what about you? What surprised you in this work?
I think I'm going to continue with the thread of positivity. I was pleasantly surprised by how much positivity people expressed towards public servants. We saw that in our survey, where close to a majority of people agreed that they are hardworking and competent. But most importantly, we saw that in focus groups, when people gave really good, have had very positive feelings towards public servants. They said that they deserve accolades, that their day-to-day work needs to be highlighted. And that was really heartwarming and nice to hear. I was also surprised by the fact that close to half of our respondents thought that their personal experiences with the government were positive. Which means that we still have a long way to go, because that means that half of the respondents thought that they were not mostly positive, but I still find that very encouraging that almost half of our nation feels like their interactions were on the positive side.
So Paul, one of the reasons we did this effort is that we were a little frustrated by the fact that there's all kinds of research saying Americans don't trust government, but there's not as much about why and what drives that. Is it rational? Is it something we can do anything about? Is it just inherent? So I know that you spent a lot of time in this effort trying to understand some of those factors that influence an individual's trust in government. So I would love to hear from both of you about some of those that stood out. So I'll start with you, Paul, and then go to Nadzeya.
So again, we asked a lot of questions about when people thought of the government in general, the federal government overall, and some of the words and some of the survey results we got, there was a lot of talk about the government being too bureaucratic, excuse me. 75% of people agreed that the government was too bureaucratic. Wasteful was another one, and a lot of desire for more transparency. A lot of people saying that they want the federal government to be more transparent, to be more accountable. And that was a common thread we heard in the focus groups as well. We heard those words quite a lot. And then, I'll let Nadzeya address some of the other stuff we found from a more personal standpoint.
Nadzeya, what about you?
Yeah, I started talking about us asking about people's personal experiences, and mentioned that almost half of our respondents felt that their experiences with the government were mostly positive. So we found that personal experience is a big predictor of whether people trust the government or they don't. So out of people who said that their personal experiences were not mostly positive, only 14% of them at the same time trusted the government. And that is versus 64%, excuse me, of people who had positive experiences and at the same time trusted the government. So these numbers are quite drastically different. And we feel that improving personal experiences could have a huge positive impact on the overall level of trust.
That actually builds nicely into my next question, Nadia, and that is around what can be done to improve trust in government. And I'll start this point by noting that, as I said at the beginning, there's so much of a view of government that is just an inherently untrustworthy, or it is just an inherent problem that people won't trust government. It's not something that we can do much about. And we went in, at least with the hope, if not the hypothesis, that that was not the case. This is something that we actually can do something about, and that it's important to the strength of our democracy to take on in some form. But I'm curious, is this just about messaging, or is it about improving government, or is it both? And what are some of the things that we can actually do, whether at the Partnership for Public Service or in working with government, to actually improve that relationship between the public and government? Paul?
So that's sort of the million-dollar question there. I would say there were two things we found in the research that I thought were particularly promising. One was something we talked about a little bit already, is when you can get people to think about government outside of politics. We saw people in some focus groups, people actually said, you know, this makes me remember the things the government does that I don't think about. Or one person I recall saying, you know, this actually makes me look at my own biases again. So I think, you know, widening people's conception of government. Obviously, Congress is a huge part of the government, no question about that. But if we can work to get people to think, when they hear government, to think a little bit more broadly, not just the halls of Congress, but the 2 million other people around the country who work for the federal government, I think there's real potential there. Something else we found was very good responses to stories about individual public servants who were really excellent. The partnership sponsors an award ceremony every year called the Sammys, and we showed some videos of that to some participants of some of the really excellent award winners, and the responses were really remarkable. I thought the responses would be good. They were really strong. People saying, you know, this person gives me new respect to the government. We asked if people thought there were other people like them in the government, and people across the political spectrum said, yes, we think there are people like that throughout the government. So I think those two things, you know, shifting people's focus a bit, and then also highlighting individual stories, I think those showed to be very promising ways to perhaps improve some of the views that people have of the government.
So last question for both of you. I mean, obviously we went into this with a hope and a hypothesis that things can be done. And we also went into it knowing that we at the Partnership for Public Service want to play a key role in helping rebuild, re-strengthen, redefine this relationship between government and the American people, whether in helping government tell its story better or in helping government become a more trustworthy institution. So we have some big plans, but I want to hear from both of you on, do you think we are likely to see higher levels of trust in government in the near future? And if we do, what impact might that have? So I'll start with you, Nadia, and then finish up with Paul.
Yeah, I think Paul started us off nicely by highlighting what we heard from people that we had a chance to talk about the trust in government with, and the response of these people makes me feel very positive. Also, the fact that we are having this conversation right now, I think also makes me feel hopeful, because attention towards certain problems means that there is intention and there is hope for improvement. In terms of what would change, I think it brings us to the beginning of our conversation when we discussed why trust is important. So I think it will eventually bring us better political participation, and that means stronger democracy.
Paul, what about you? What's going to happen?
Oh boy, so that, even though I had a suspicion this question was coming, I still don't know necessarily what I would predict. I think there are definitely opportunities. There's a whole lot of factors at play in our country and that are pushing different directions. I definitely think there's real potential, as we've talked about, that if there's a sort of a vigilance, and that the government continues to respond to the public and communicate well with the public, I think there's openings there to do things. And when you look at parts of the government, like the military, like the Park Service, there are parts of the government that are very well respected. And so it's not as if that can't happen. I think another, in sort of what would the impact be, one thing Nadia mentioned earlier about recruiting, that's such an important part of getting good talent into the government. And so having something that's more attractive to college graduates and other people is really important. And another thing that I think we found is that low trust actually gets in the way of some of the improvements and improvements, I guess, reform, excuse me, thank you, that's the right word, in way, you know, of improvements and reforms that the government needs to make. Improving any institution takes time, it takes money and resources, and low trust has, you know, people sometimes are not eager to give agencies those times and resources, but if they're going to improve, if they're going to learn lessons and make things better, they need to be able to invest in that. And so I think that's another really big part of this research, and that's really important for people in the government to think about too.
So Paul and Nadia, thank you both so much for sharing with so much from our most recent report on trust in government with our audience here. For those who joined a little bit late, the report is Trust in Government, a close look at public perceptions of the federal government and its employees, out today from the Partnership for Public Service and our incredible partners at Friedman Consulting. This is just the first step. You'll hear more from us on trust in government over the coming months, and we look forward to working with all of you to improve this relationship. Thanks so much.